The duck stared at her like it knew something she didn't. Probably did. Because just as Karen raised her phone to snap a picture of me feeding them, yelling about HOA violations and $500 fines, one of the ducks let out the loudest, sassiest quack I've ever heard in my life, and took a crap right on her designer sandals. The look on her face was somewhere between a courtroom objection and a toddler who just tasted a lemon. And me? I just smiled. Because what she didn't know was that I wasn't just feeding ducks. I was conducting a federally mandated wetland behavioral survey. And I'm not just her neighbor. I'm a wildlife officer. And she had just picked the absolute worst possible duck feeding hill to die on. It all started with a pretty normal Saturday morning. The sun was up, the air was crisp, and I had just filled a small scoop with specialty duck chow I get from a conservation supplier. Nothing dramatic. No breadcrumbs. No junk food. Just high-protein pellets for a small family of mallards that had made a cozy little home near the reeds at the edge of my yard. Technically, my backyard touches part of a protected wetland easement. I know that because my job is literally protecting it. But in this neighborhood, common sense evaporates faster than a puddle in Phoenix. So I was just there, minding my business, tossing feed and jotting notes in my waterproof notepad, when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of entitlement, heels clacking across decorative pavers. She stomped through the grass like she owned the earth itself, her clipboard swinging like a weapon of mass irritation. She had the HOA badge clipped to her shirt like a federal agent, only with none of the authority and all the delusion. Excuse me. That's a clear violation of HOA Policy 4C27. No feeding wildlife on community grounds. I turned, confused but patient. Actually, this section is technically private property that happens to border. She cut me off with a raised hand like she was stopping traffic. Doesn't matter. We voted last quarter. Feeding ducks encourages aggression, droppings, and disease. It's a $500 fine, and I'm logging it now. I glanced down at the ducks, who were now cautiously waddling away from the human bullhorn in capri pants. One of them quacked softly, as if apologizing for her behavior. I was tempted to apologize back, but I had other things to focus on, like this train wreck of a woman who thought HOA policy could override federal environmental law. You mind showing me that bylaw? I asked calmly. She huffed. It's in the binder. I don't have to show it to you. You'll get your violation notice in the mail. Right. But you should know I'm not just tossing feed. I'm performing a federally authorized wildlife survey under the North American Wetland Conservation Act. You might want to take a breath. She laughed. Actually laughed. The kind of laugh that sounds like a blender chewing on pennies. Oh please, don't get cute with me. What, you watched a documentary and now you think you're Ranger Rick? That was when I opened my side pouch, pulled out a laminated ID, and held it up for her to see. Her smile melted faster than a snowman in July. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm literally the regional field officer responsible for this stretch of the marsh. What you just tried to do could be classified as obstruction of a federal survey. You sure you want to find me? She blinked. Twice. Then tried to rally. Well, that wetland is still governed by community policy and… No, I said, cutting her off now. That wetland is protected under federal statute. You don't have jurisdiction here, and your HOA rules don't override federal conservation laws. In fact, if your little no-feeding rule causes residents to withhold food from protected species, you could be on the hook for creating a hostile environment for endangered or migratory wildlife. Which, as it happens, those ducks fall under. She looked down at the birds like they'd just betrayed her. One duck let out a triumphant honk. You're making this up. I smiled. Want me to get my supervisor on the phone? Or maybe we go another way. You send me the fine. I submit it with my federal paperwork. We open an investigation into the HOA's interference in a protected zone. For the first time in her entire clipboard-wielding life, Karen hesitated. She looked at the ducks, the ID, then back at me, eyes twitching like her brain was buffering. I could practically hear the dial-up tone behind her eyeballs. She didn't say a word, just turned on her heel and stormed off, shoes squelching as she stomped back toward her SUV. The ducks waddled back into position, unconcerned. Now, I'd hoped that would be the end of it. But people like Karen don't retreat, they reload. By the time I returned from my afternoon patrol shift, there were 4 flyers taped around the neighborhood, bright red lettering that screamed, "Do not feed the ducks. $500 HOA fine. Report violators immediately." She even included a phone number to call anonymously, which, funny enough, rang straight to her own phone. The next morning, my neighbor's kid got caught tossing Cheerios into the reeds and came home crying because the angry lady yelled about duck jail. Another neighbor, a retired man who'd been feeding the same birds for 15 years, got a written warning stuck to his garage door. And Karen? She was loving every minute of it. I saw her outside with binoculars, scanning the yards like a poacher with a vengeance. She had just declared war on the duck, which meant, unintentionally, she had declared war on me. I didn't need to retaliate with pettiness or revenge. I had something better: the law, the facts, and a pile of very angry ducks on my side. And when I opened the file on my desk the next morning, filled with breeding patterns, migratory tags, and drone footage from last spring's nesting surveys, I realized something she really didn't want to hear. Karen had done more than yell. She had crossed a legal boundary, one that was about to bite her in the rear harder than a mother goose guarding her eggs. She thought she was protecting the neighborhood. She was actually tampering with a federally protected habitat, and I was going to make sure she knew just how badly she'd messed up. By the time Karen's flyers had made it to every mailbox in the neighborhood, the ducks had become public enemy number 1. She'd plastered lampposts, fences, and community boards with bold red warnings, claiming feeding ducks attracted disease, aggressive geese, and unsanitary wildlife activity. She even went so far as to cite a fabricated article from a non-existent university about avian-based HOA deterioration. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so dangerously misinformed. Unfortunately, not everyone knew better. A few nervous neighbors actually stopped feeding the birds out of fear of being fined, while others tried to quietly sneak breadcrumbs under cover of dusk. One poor guy tossed some grains behind a bush and got caught on Karen's ring cam. She uploaded the footage to the HOA Facebook group with the caption, "Bird Enabler Caught on Tape." I tried to stay calm at first. Let the circus implode under its own nonsense. But when a neighbor's garden fountain was removed by Karen because it encouraged ducks to linger, I knew this wasn't just harmless HOA overreach. She was actively disrupting the ecosystem. And worse? She was doing it with a warped sense of righteousness. She wasn't just on a power trip, she believed she was saving the community from a feathered uprising. The irony? The actual problem wasn't the ducks. It was her. So I did what any professional wildlife officer would do. I opened a case file. I pulled historical aerial photos of the neighborhood showing the wetland borders. I included survey results, migratory nesting records, and documentation showing the mallards and teals in the area were on the protected migratory species list. I also noted that several of the nests Karen had recently destroyed during her beautification initiative fell within the federal wetland buffer zone. Meaning? She didn't just break a rule. She broke the law. Specifically, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And that opened the door to a much more serious investigation. While I was compiling the case, Karen was out gathering complaints. She cornered residents at the mailbox and asked if they'd seen any duck activity near my yard. She even tried to bribe a teenager with $10 to record video of me feeding birds again. The teen told her to pound sand. But Karen wasn't discouraged, she upped her efforts. Soon she was leaving laminated flyers on doorsteps claiming I was under federal review for illegal duck feeding practices, which would have been hilarious if it weren't so completely backwards. So I decided to escalate legally. I called in a favor from a colleague, Maria, a brilliant field biologist and enforcement liaison. I asked her to swing by for a surprise inspection. Nothing too flashy. Just a low-key walk through the wetland to assess habitat disruption. She showed up in jeans and boots, clipboard in hand, and started quietly inspecting the area with a practiced eye. Karen spotted her from across the road and, mistaking her for a landscaping consultant, practically sprinted over. "Are you here about the duck situation? Because I have tons of evidence." One of them chased a toddler. "They're violent." Maria gave her a smile that could cut glass. "Actually, I'm here with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Just conducting an impact assessment related to recent habitat alterations." Karen blinked. "Wait, you're with what?" Maria flipped open her badge. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a malfunctioning garage door. "We've had some reports of interference with migratory bird nesting," Maria continued, professionally detached. "Especially in areas where native vegetation was removed." Karen tried to backpedal. "That was HOA-sanctioned landscaping. We were just removing unsightly brush." "That unsightly brush," Maria said, "was nesting cover for 2 protected waterfowl species. And based on the GPS coordinates logged in our last drone flyover, you may have disturbed an active nest site." Karen looked like someone had just told her she'd bulldozed a national monument. "I didn't know. No one said anything. It was just overgrown." Ignorance wasn't going to be a valid defense, and Maria knew it. She made a few notes on her clipboard and moved on. Karen just stood there, completely still, probably realizing for the first time in her HOA reign that her clipboard didn't outrank a federal badge. That night, she went silent on the neighborhood Facebook group. No rants, no surveillance screenshot, not even a passive-aggressive meme about bird poop. Something had shifted. But the peace didn't last. 2 days later, a strange thing happened. I woke up to find my yard littered with breadcrumbs. Old, moldy white bread, scattered in piles around my duck feeding station. The ducks weren't eating it. They're smarter than that. But the implication was clear. Someone was trying to set me up. I checked my security cams and, sure enough, there she was, Karen, tiptoeing onto my lawn at 1:37 a.m., dumping bags of bread while glancing over her shoulder like a raccoon with a purse. I sent the footage to Maria, who forwarded it straight to the regional enforcement office. At that point, Karen had crossed from nuisance into potential obstruction of a federal agent. The level of stupidity was honestly impressive. But she didn't stop there. That afternoon, she called the local sheriff's department and reported me. Claimed I was illegally baiting wildlife, and that the ducks were creating a public health crisis. An actual deputy showed up at my door. He looked annoyed. "I'm real sorry about this," he said, scratching his head. "But we got a call from your HOA president. Something about illegal duck trafficking?" I showed him my badge. Then I showed him the footage. The deputy stared at the screen for a few seconds, then just shook his head. "She's gonna lose her mind when she finds out who you are." "Oh, I think she already did," I said. He laughed and left. But the damage was already spreading. More neighbors came forward, some saying Karen had threatened them with fines for even talking to me. Others admitted she had slipped warning letters into their mailboxes without board approval. A few had started feeding the ducks again quietly at night, just to avoid her wrath. The community was fracturing, and the ducks were caught in the middle. The next evening, as I was filling out more paperwork and updating the case file, I heard a commotion near the marsh. I stepped outside and saw Karen, again, stomping through the reeds with a rake. She was jabbing at something near the edge of the water. I walked over, heart sinking. She had installed anti-bird spikes on a wooden post near the pond, the kind meant to deter pigeons from perching. One of the spikes had punctured the foot of a Canada goose. The bird limped away, bleeding slightly, as Karen muttered something about invasive species. This time, I didn't say a word. I just called it in. Karen had just officially harmed a protected migratory species. And now, it was no longer a neighborhood issue. It was a federal one. It didn't take long for word to spread that Karen had injured a protected goose. By the next morning, the neighborhood group chat was ablaze with speculation, screenshots, and blurry photos of the poor bird limping through the reeds like it had just come out of a turf war. People were furious. Even some of Karen's usual supporters, the ones who had defended her when she complained about seasonal wreaths or the color of a mailbox, started backing away. But true to Karen form, instead of apologizing or disappearing quietly into the background like any rational person, she did what only Karen would do. She went on the offensive. She called for an emergency HOA meeting. The notice went out within hours. Printed flyers were shoved into mailboxes, stapled to trees, and taped over community notice board. Emergency HOA session, 7 p.m., a clubhouse topic. Unauthorized activity endangering neighborhood safety. No mention of ducks. No mention of her injury to a federally protected bird. Just the vague, ominous implication that I, somehow, was the threat. I almost didn't go. But then I thought, no. Let her try. Let her put on her show. Let's see what happens when the audience knows the magician is hiding cards up her sleeve and the deck's already rigged against her. I arrived 5 minutes early. Karen was already at the front of the clubhouse room, clipboard in hand, standing like a politician about to declare war. She wore a power suit 2 sizes too small and had rearranged the seating so everyone faced her podium. There were cookies on a folding table, store-bought, of course, and probably left out all day. A few other board members sat nearby, noticeably uncomfortable. She spotted me, plastered on a smile, and said loudly, our neighborhood conservationist has arrived. A few people gave me awkward nods. Some smirked. Others avoided eye contact entirely. She started the meeting with a theatrical throat-clearing and an emotional appeal about safety, order, and how she only ever wanted to preserve the beauty and dignity of our community. It was almost impressive how she danced around the facts, never once using the words duck, goose, spike, or federal investigation. Just lots of disturbances, conflicts, and vague warnings about misuse of private land. Then came the real bombshell. She proposed a vote to have me removed from the HOA board entirely. I regret to inform you, she said, pretending to look sad, that Mr. Blake has not only disregarded neighborhood policy, but his behavior has now resulted in escalating tensions with local law enforcement and caused documented injury to wildlife. Someone in the back whispered, "Didn't you do that?" Karen glared but pressed on. "I am moving to remove him from the HOA board effective immediately, pending vote." I stood. Calmly. Slowly. Everyone turned. The room had gone quiet except for the buzz of the faulty ceiling fan. "Before you vote," I said, reaching into my bag, "I'd like to provide some context." I pulled out a folder and walked to the front. Karen tried to intercept me, but I sidestepped her and placed the folder on the table in front of the other board members. Inside were printed copies of the following: the federal permit I carried authorizing wildlife surveys in the protected wetland zone, a photographic record of Karen's unauthorized landscaping project where she tore out nesting brush, and a still from my security camera of her dumping moldy bread on my property. I'd also included Maria's preliminary report and a copy of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act sections highlighting what Karen had violated. I didn't even need to raise my voice. "Everything I've done has been within the bounds of federal law," I said plainly. "Everything she's done, from fining neighbors illegally to tampering with a nesting site, hasn't just broken HOA policy. It's violated state and federal statutes." Karen laughed. A weird, high-pitched nervous laugh. "This is ridiculous. Are we really taking the word of someone feeding ducks over the president of the HOA?" That's when the door opened, and in walked Maria, in her full U.S. Fish and Wildlife uniform. The timing was poetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said coolly, "but I'm here on official business. We've completed our preliminary investigation, and I need to speak with a Ms. Karen Dunley regarding the installation of harmful deterrents in a federally protected wetland zone. You could have heard a feather drop. Karen went pale, then red, then pale again. This is a private meeting, you can't just barge in. Maria held up a small document. I have a federal subpoena for any and all HOA communications involving policies related to wildlife deterrence and resident complaints regarding wetland activity. I also have a copy of your correspondence with local law enforcement where you falsely accused a federal officer of misconduct. The silence in the room turned nuclear. Karen stumbled for words. This is a setup. He's using his position to target me. Actually, Maria said, he's been unusually patient. We normally issue citations much faster. Karen stormed out of the room, knocking over a folding chair as she passed. No one followed her. That night, the clubhouse meeting turned into an impromptu strategy session. People started sharing their own horror stories. Fines for the wrong porch light bulb, citations for birdbaths, even someone who'd been threatened for hanging wind chimes too close to HOA sound standards. One neighbor admitted she'd been afraid to report Karen's behavior because she thought the board would always back her. Not anymore. I didn't ask to be voted back onto the HOA board. They did it anyway. Unanimously. And that might have been the end of it. But Karen still wasn't done. The next morning, I found something odd in my driveway. A gift bag. Inside were broken duck figurines, a sarcastic "I love nature" mug, and a typed note. You think you've won. But the HOA never forgets. I almost laughed. Almost. Because when I went to check my email, I had already received the first forwarded legal document from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Karen wasn't just facing a citation anymore. She was under formal investigation for environmental violations, harassment of a federal officer, and attempting to falsify HOA document. And she had no idea the next move was already out of her hands. The ducks, meanwhile, were back to swimming peacefully. One waddled up to the edge of my porch as I sipped coffee. I swear it nodded at me. It wasn't over. But it was turning into something far bigger than HOA drama. Karen had picked the wrong pond. The subpoena hit harder than anyone expected. Karen must have thought it was all bark. Just a scare tactic, some overblown paperwork that would vanish in a pile of community mailers about fertilizer restrictions and pool hours. But the moment she realized it was real, that it had teeth, she started spiraling. I didn't even have to do anything. She unraveled all on her own. First came the cease and desist letter, delivered straight to her door by a federal officer. The letter outlined her violations in plain language: unauthorized interference in a federally protected wetland, harassment of protected migratory species, falsifying neighborhood ordinances to manipulate resident behavior, and submitting fraudulent claims to local law enforcement regarding a federal agent. It was worded like a chainsaw with manners. It didn't scream, it sliced. And it told her, in no uncertain terms, to stop all enforcement activities and communications related to wildlife until further notice. Karen, naturally, refused. The very next day, she fired off an email to the entire HOA contact list claiming she was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign led by rogue government agents with an agenda. She called the ducks weaponized, referred to the Wildlife Survey as bird-based surveillance, and accused me of hiding military equipment in the cattails behind my yard. It was the kind of conspiracy theory rant that made you want to simultaneously laugh and check for tinfoil. The email was forwarded to me by 6 different neighbors within an hour. One person simply added, "She's gone full Swan's piracy." The HOA attorney, a tired man who had clearly aged a decade in a week, officially resigned that same day. Apparently, Karen had ignored all his advice, sent legal responses without his approval, and tried to get him to draft a cease and desist against the Department of Fish and Wildlife itself. He declined. She threatened to replace him with someone who understands community loyalty. He walked quietly, efficiently, and with the grace of a man who'd escaped a burning ship while the captain screamed at seagulls. With her legal counsel gone, Karen started taking matters into her own hands. She printed out massive banners and hung them on her front porch. One read, "Free the neighborhood from duck tyranny." Another said, "The wetlands are lying." She stood on the sidewalk waving to passing cars like she was running for office on an anti-bird platform. One poor Amazon driver slowed down, unsure if he should deliver her package or throw it from a safe distance. But it got worse. Someone leaked the incident to a local news station. A short segment aired under the title, "Quack Crackdown, HOA President Fined for Harming Protected Wildlife." It included blurred footage of Karen storming across the wetlands, rake in hand, plus a still shot of the injured goose. The reporter's tone was painfully neutral, but you could practically hear the disbelief in her voice. The story went semi-viral online, thanks to the absurdity of it all. One clip of Karen yelling, "These birds are government tools," was turned into a TikTok sound. Within days, people were making duck-themed remixes and mocking campaign posters. Karen couldn't take it. She tried to spin the story as media bias, claimed she was being cancelled by nature. Her next move? She filed a formal request with the county to have the wetland rezoned as non-environmentally significant, citing her belief that the ducks were domesticated freeloaders. The request was not only denied, it triggered a county-level inspection that revealed she had also dumped landscaping debris into a runoff channel, violating municipal code. The fines began to stack up. First, it was the $25,000 penalty for disturbing the migratory nesting area. Then a $10,000 local fine for improper waste disposal. An additional $5,000 for unauthorized signage in a public zone. The numbers were rising like floodwater, and Karen was stuck in the middle with no boots and no plan. In response, she tried to rally her loyalists. She hosted a backyard meeting for the last few remaining residents who hadn't completely abandoned her cause. A few showed up out of curiosity. Most just wanted to see the meltdown in person. Karen handed out flyers again, this time marked "Confidential, Save Our Community from Federal Infiltration." She claimed the ducks were being used to monitor her internet usage. She pointed at a mallard and said, "He knows." The mallard blinked and continued eating grass. Somehow, despite everything, Karen still didn't quit. She submitted a proposal to the HOA board to begin removal of all avian-attracting lawn ornaments, ponds, birdhouses, and even decorative flags with bird images. The new HOA president, recently elected after a landslide vote that saw Karen's position eliminated entirely, replied with a single sentence, "This is not a kindergarten dictatorship." Karen didn't respond. Instead, she called the police again, this time on me. She claimed I was planting duck eggs near her porch. The responding officer, who had dealt with her before, simply asked if she had video proof. She did not. He asked if any ducks had actually approached her house. She pointed to one waddling across the street. The officer, now thoroughly done with her nonsense, said, "That's not harassment. That's gravity," and left. The final nail came a week later when the wetland was officially named a community co-op conservation zone by the county board. I had submitted the paperwork months ago, long before any of this drama started, and the approval just happened to arrive at the perfect moment. It meant the land was now protected not only federally, but by community initiative with educational resources, a small grant for preservation activities, and yes, the right for residents to participate in supervised feeding. Karen's worst nightmare had been formalized, notarized, and printed on county letterhead. To celebrate, the community held an unofficial duck day. There were duck-themed cookies, a face-painting booth, and a station where kids could learn about wetland preservation. The ducks got extra feed, the goose's injury had healed, and the mood was overwhelmingly joyful. A local teacher even brought her class to visit the site for a hands-on nature lesson. The kids loved it. The ducks loved it. Karen, from behind her curtains, did not. She never showed her face at the event. But we did see her watching. arms crossed, jaw tight, curtain clutched like it might offer her protection from the sheer joy unfolding in the community she used to control. One kid spotted her and waved. Karen yanked the curtain shut like the window owed her money. I heard later she tried to sell her house. But with the media coverage, legal mess, and reputation as the duck dictator of Rosemarsh Lane, no buyers came forward. She took the listing down within a month. And still, not once did she say sorry. But maybe that was for the best. Because if she had apologized, even sincerely, she might have gotten a shred of dignity back. Instead, all she was left with were fines, memes, and a neighborhood that had officially moved on without her. The ducks were safe. The wetlands were protected. And justice had landed with all the grace of a goose touching down on still water. The quiet that settled over the neighborhood in the weeks after Duck Day was almost eerie. For the first time in a long while, people walked their dogs without side-eyeing each other. Neighbors waved from across the street, and someone even started leaving tiny hand-painted duck rocks along the trail that wound near the wetlands. The whole place had shifted, like it had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Karen, for her part, had become a ghost. Her SUV didn't move. Her porch light stayed off. The once proud clipboard warrior was now barely a shadow behind slanted blinds, vanishing if anyone so much as glanced toward her window. Every now and then, you'd see her peeking through a gap, glaring at the ducks as if they personally stole her lawn ornaments and sense of control. I kept doing what I'd always done. I logged surveys, fed the birds responsibly, and maintained the habitat with support from the community. Except now, I wasn't doing it alone. People volunteered to help. One neighbor installed a duck crossing sign at the curve in the road. Another family built a floating nesting platform with their kids, painting it bright blue and naming it Quack Quarters. The transformation was both hilarious and heartwarming. The same people who once tiptoed around HOA threats were now proudly wearing shirts that said, Team Duck. And in the middle of it all, waddling like royalty, were the birds that started it all. It would have been a peaceful ending, but Karen never did know when to stop. She tried one last time to claw back control, filing an anonymous complaint to the county's zoning board, claiming the ducks were causing water damage to her property. Unfortunately for her, the complaint wasn't just dismissed, it was flagged. See, when you've already been cited for multiple environmental violations and you're under ongoing investigation, every new complaint gets filtered through legal before anyone even looks at it. And in her case, the filing had all the subtlety of a toddler trying to sneak cookies from the jar. They traced it back to her in under an hour. The kicker? The ducks never even came within 15 feet of her property. She was still mad about one goose that had looked at her mailbox wrong 6 weeks ago. At this point, I was ready to let it all fade out quietly. Karen had lost everything she clung to. Her title, her reputation, her control. The community had bounced back stronger than ever, and the wetlands were thriving. But fate, or maybe just cosmic justice, had one last little surprise. A few weeks later, I received a formal invitation to a county wildlife and conservation gala. Black tie, catered dinner, speeches. I didn't think much of it until I saw the honoree list. My name was there, under Outstanding Community Preservation Efforts. I laughed for a full minute. Not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I could already imagine Karen's face if she found out. The man she tried to find for feeding ducks was being awarded for helping save the habitat she tried to destroy. The gala was hosted at a local nature center, and it was genuinely lovely. People shared stories about conservation wins, discussed future projects, and donated to wildlife causes. When I got up to speak, I kept it short. I told them how sometimes the smallest fights, like feeding a duck, turn into the biggest battles. How standing your ground, especially when the other side is loud and petty, matters. And how, sometimes, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building something that lasts while the people who tried to tear it down get buried by their own noise. I didn't name Karen. I didn't have to. The next morning, a local paper ran a story about the event. My name was in it. So was a photo of me shaking hands with the mayor and standing next to a poster-sized photo of the wetland at sunrise. That's when the doorbell rang. Karen was standing there, tight-lipped, clutching a piece of newspaper like it had personally insulted her family. She didn't speak right away. Just stared, eyes twitching like she was debating whether to yell or cry or both. "I saw the article," she said finally, voice flat. I nodded, waiting. "I never meant to," she started, then stopped. "You made me look insane." "You did that all by yourself," I said calmly. For a second, I thought she was going to scream. But she just blinked, breathed, and walked away. No apology. No admission. Just retreat. That was the last time she ever stood on my porch. A few weeks later, her house went up for sale again, quietly this time. No yard signs, no announcements. Just a listing buried in a website. The price had dropped substantially, and word spread fast. Apparently, she'd moved to a condo 3 towns over. No yard. No pond. No ducks. The community, meanwhile, flourished. We got a small grant to install educational signs along the trail. Local schools started visiting for field trip. The ducks multiplied, happy and unbothered. Even the goose that Karen injured had returned. He limped slightly but seemed to enjoy his newfound celebrity status. Kids named him Waddles. He'd become the unofficial mascot of our very official conservation zone. On the 1-year anniversary of Duck Day, we threw another party. Bigger this time. Food trucks came. A local band played a surprisingly catchy song called "Karen Hates the Quacks." Someone brought cupcakes shaped like little ducks, complete with tiny edible sunglasses. As the sun set, we lit lanterns and floated them across the pond. Each one carried a wish or a message of thanks. One of them said, in careful kid handwriting, "Thank you ducks for staying even when people were mean." I stood back, watching the lights drift and reflect on the water. The laughter, the music, the sense of peace, it all felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else entirely. Maybe Karen had been right about one thing, though not the way she intended. The ducks did change the neighborhood. But not for the worse. They brought us together. They reminded us what matters. And they proved, once and for all, that you don't mess with nature, or the people who protect it, unless you're prepared to get absolutely outquacked.